I never imagined the man I promised to love until my last breath would be the one to betray me so deeply. Last night, I found out my husband had tried to drug me. This morning, I woke up knowing everything had changed forever. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. Before we begin, I'd be truly grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me keep sharing these stories with those who need them most. My hands were shaking as I stood in our small kitchen in Queens, the morning light filtering through the yellowed curtains I'd been meaning to replace for years. I could hear Robert in the bedroom, his familiar heavy breathing, the creak of the mattress as he turned over. Everything looked the same as it had for the past 37 years, but nothing would ever be the same again. The white ceramic mug I held felt cold against my palms, and I stared at the small medicine bottle I'd found hidden behind the coffee canister. My stomach turned as I read the label again. Prescription pills that weren't mine, that I'd never seen before. The discovery had happened by accident the night before. I'd been reaching for the sugar when my elbow knocked over a tin of tea bags, and there it was, tucked behind everything else, a bottle with Robert's name on it but a medication I didn't recognize. When I looked it up on my phone, the words on the screen made my vision blur. Sedative. Strong enough to make someone sleep for hours. Strong enough to keep someone quiet. I thought back to the past few weeks, the strange fog that had settled over me some mornings, the way I'd wake up disoriented, unable to remember going to bed. The cups of tea Robert had been so insistent I drink before bedtime. His sudden attentiveness, bringing me warm milk, offering to make my favorite chamomile blend. I'd thought he was finally being thoughtful after years of distance. Now I understood it had been something much darker. The memories came rushing back with sickening clarity. 2 weeks ago, I'd woken up on the couch fully dressed, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Robert said I'd fallen asleep watching TV and he hadn't wanted to wake me. 3 weeks before that, I'd missed an important doctor's appointment, something I never did, because I'd slept through 3 alarms. Robert had been unusually sympathetic, suggesting maybe I needed more rest. And a month ago, I'd lost an entire evening, hours that simply vanished from my consciousness. When I'd asked Robert about it, he'd looked at me with concern and suggested I might need to see a neurologist about memory problems. Memory problems. The words echoed in my mind now with sinister new meaning. He'd been planning this carefully, systematically making me doubt my own mind while slowly poisoning me into submission. The apartment around me felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in with the weight of this truth. Outside the window, I could hear the familiar sounds of our neighborhood, the bus grinding to a stop on the corner, someone's radio playing salsa music, the eternal honking of New York traffic. Life continuing as normal while mine shattered into pieces I wasn't sure I could put back together. I walked to the window and looked down at the street below. Mrs. Chen from the corner store was setting out her display of fruits, the same as she'd done every morning for the 20 years I'd lived in this building. The mailman made his rounds, greeting people by name. A young mother pushed a stroller, talking on her phone. Normal life, safe life. The life I'd thought I had. I set the mug down carefully, my hands still trembling. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. But a deeper part of me, the part that had learned to survive through decades of small humiliations and quiet disappointments, told me to wait, to think, to plan. I opened the bottle and counted the pills. 30 total, but according to the prescription date, there should have been more. How many had he already given me? How long had this been going on? My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. What had he been doing while I was unconscious? What had he been hiding? What was he planning? Robert emerged from the bedroom in his old bathrobe, the one with the frayed collar I'd offered to replace 100 times. He didn't look at me as he shuffled to the coffee maker, didn't notice the way I stood frozen by the counter, didn't see the bottle I'd quickly hidden in my pocket when I heard his footsteps. "Good morning," he muttered, his standard greeting. devoid of warmth or real acknowledgement. Just words, a habit, like everything else between us had become. I forced myself to respond normally. "Morning. Coffee's ready." He grunted in acknowledgement, and I watched him pour his coffee with a detachment I'd never felt before. It was as if I was seeing him for the first time through clear eyes, stripped of all the stories I'd told myself about who he was, who we were together. The man standing in my kitchen was a stranger. Perhaps he'd always been a stranger, and I'd just been too invested in the fantasy to notice. I watched him pour his coffee, add the exact amount of cream he always did, the routine so familiar it was almost painful. This man, this stranger wearing my husband's face, had tried to drug me, had been drugging me. The thought kept circling in my mind like a bird trapped in a room, desperate and confused. "How's your morning going?" I asked, testing him, watching his face carefully. He barely glanced at me. "Fine. Got a meeting at 10. A lie. He'd been retired for 3 years. Where was he really going? Who was he meeting? The questions multiplied like cells dividing, each one revealing how little I actually knew about the man I'd spent most of my life with. When had it started? When had I become someone to be silenced rather than heard? I thought back through the years, trying to pinpoint the moment we'd crossed from partnership to something twisted and unrecognizable. Maybe it had been gradual, so slow I hadn't noticed until it was too late. Or maybe there had been signs all along that I'd chosen not to see. I remembered the early years, when Robert had charm and ambition, when he'd promised me a life of adventure and comfort. I'd believed him. I'd worked double shifts at the hospital while he pursued his business ventures, one after another, each one promising to be the breakthrough we needed. I'd supported him through failures and false starts, through mood swings and angry outbursts that he always blamed on stress. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say whenever I tried to talk about us, about the growing distance between us. "You just don't understand." And I'd accepted that. I'd made myself smaller, quieter, more convenient. I'd forgiven the missed anniversaries, the forgotten birthdays, the times he'd promised to be home for dinner and didn't show up until midnight. I'd told myself that this was what marriage meant, that love required sacrifice, that my needs were less important than keeping the peace. But there was one anniversary I remembered with particular pain, our 20th. I'd planned for weeks, saved money from my nursing shifts, made reservations at the restaurant where he'd proposed. I'd bought a new dress, something I rarely did for myself. I'd waited at that restaurant for 2 hours, calling his phone repeatedly. While the waiter brought water and bread with increasingly sympathetic looks, Robert finally answered around 10 p.m., drunk with his buddies at a sports bar, having completely forgotten. When I'd gotten home, crying, he'd been angry at me for making him feel guilty, for not understanding that he needed to unwind sometimes, that I was too demanding, too needy, too much. I'd apologized to him that night, apologized for having expectations, apologized for my own hurt. Looking back now, I couldn't comprehend how I'd twisted myself into that shape, how I'd learned to make his failures my fault. Our children had grown up in that atmosphere. Michael in Seattle, barely calling once a month. Jennifer in Miami, always too busy with her own life to visit. They'd learned from watching us, learned that mothers were there to give and never ask for anything in return. That fathers could be distant and demanding and never face consequences. I'd given them everything I had. I'd worked night shifts to pay for their college educations while Robert's investments in the stock market went nowhere. I'd been there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph and disappointment. And when they'd left, when they'd built their own lives in cities far away, they'd taken my sacrifices for granted and never looked back. I remembered Michael's graduation from college. I'd worked 70 hours that week to afford the flight to California, but I'd been there, beaming in the audience as he accepted his diploma. Robert had been there too, having borrowed money from his brother for the trip, money I'd later learned he'd never repaid. At the celebration dinner, Michael had given a speech thanking his father for always believing in him, for being his role model. He'd mentioned me almost as an afterthought. And thanks to Mom for, everything. Robert had glowed with pride all evening while I'd picked at my pasta and tried to convince myself that it didn't hurt, that I wasn't keeping score, that love wasn't supposed to be recognized or appreciated. But it did hurt. It had always hurt. Robert sat at the small kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, completely absorbed in his own world. I could have been a piece of furniture for all the attention he paid me. And I realized that's exactly what I'd become to him. Something useful. Something to be managed and controlled. The pill bottle felt heavy in my pocket, a secret weight pressing against my hip. I knew what I should do. I should confront him right now, demand answers, call the police. But fear held me back. Fear of being alone at 64, fear of starting over, fear of admitting that I'd wasted nearly 4 decades on a man who saw me as an obstacle rather than a partner. I made myself breakfast in silence, going through the motions automatically. Toast, jam, the last of the orange juice. Robert didn't offer to share, didn't ask if I needed anything. He never did. When had I last felt like he saw me as a person rather than a convenience? As I spread jam on my toast, I noticed my hands, the age spots I'd only recently started to see, the slight tremor that had nothing to do with the discovery, and everything to do with years of exhaustion. These were hands that had held my babies, that had tended to countless patients through night shifts, that had scrubbed floors and folded laundry and signed endless permission slips and cooked thousands of meals. These were capable hands, hands that had built a life, even if that life was now revealed as a carefully constructed illusion. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer, just a reminder that she wouldn't be coming for Thanksgiving after all. Too expensive to fly, she wrote. As if I didn't know that she and her husband had just bought a vacation home in the Keys. As if I didn't know that expensive meant I'm not a priority. I typed out 3 different responses, each one expressing my hurt, my disappointment, my need to be seen as more than a convenience to be visited when it was easy. I deleted all of them and sent back, "Okay, honey. Hope you have a good holiday." The familiar ache settled in my chest, the one I'd grown so accustomed to that it felt like part of my anatomy now. The ache of being invisible to my own family, of being taken for granted, of being used up and set aside. I thought about all the money I'd given them over the years. The down payment on Michael's condo? $20,000 I'd saved over 5 years of extra shifts. The funds for Jennifer's wedding, nearly $30,000 for a single day because she'd wanted her dream wedding and I'd wanted her to be happy. The constant small loans that were never repaid. 100 here, 500 there, thousands accumulated over time. I'd depleted my savings, cashed in bonds, even borrowed against the small inheritance my mother had left me. All while Robert insisted we couldn't afford to fix the leaking roof or replace our ancient refrigerator. Where had all his money gone? The question had nagged at me for years, but I'd never pushed for real answers. He had investments, he claimed. Assets. Things I wouldn't understand. Just trust me, he'd say. And like a fool, I had. I finished my breakfast and washed my plate. Robert still absorbed in his phone. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. My 63rd birthday, just last year. I'd hinted for weeks that I wanted to go out to dinner, nothing fancy, just the 2 of us. When the day came, Robert had forgotten entirely. He'd made plans to watch a game with his brother. I'd spent the evening alone, eating leftover pasta and telling myself it didn't matter. But it did matter. It had always mattered. Every forgotten occasion, every dismissive comment, every time I'd been made to feel like my feelings were an inconvenience. They'd accumulated like stones in my pockets, weighing me down until I could barely stay afloat. I'd actually cried that birthday night, quietly in the bathroom so Robert wouldn't hear when he finally came home. I'd looked at myself in the mirror, at the tired eyes and the lines around my mouth, and I'd wondered when I'd become this person. When had I learned to accept so little? When had I stopped expecting to be loved in ways that felt like love? I looked at Robert now, really looked at him. The man I'd married had been handsome and confident, full of big dreams and bigger promises. This man was a stranger, soft around the middle, gray and unremarkable, his eyes hard with a selfishness that must have always been there, but I'd been too young and naive to recognize. What had he been planning? Why drug me? The questions spiraled through my mind. Was he trying to make me seem incompetent? Was he planning to have me committed somewhere? Or was it simpler than that? Was he just trying to keep me quiet and manageable, too sedated to ask questions or make demands? I thought about the life insurance policy we'd taken out years ago, the one where he'd insisted on being the beneficiary. I thought about the way he'd been pushing me to sign over the title to the apartment, which was in my name because my mother had helped us with the down payment decades ago. I thought about how he'd become increasingly irritated when I'd mentioned wanting to go back to work part-time, just for something to do, just to feel useful again. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture that made my blood run cold. He hadn't just been drugging me randomly. He'd been working toward something, some endgame where I was either compliant enough to give him everything he wanted, or incapacitated enough that he could take it. The anger that rose in me then was clean and sharp, cutting through years of accumulated hurt. I'd spent my whole adult life making myself smaller for this man and his needs. I'd worked myself to exhaustion, sacrificed my dreams, forgiven unforgivable things. And this was how he repaid me. Robert finally looked up from his phone. "You okay?" he asked, barely glancing in my direction. "You look upset." "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response so practiced it came out before I could think. Then I stopped myself. "Actually, no, I'm not fine." He raised an eyebrow, already dismissive. "Here we go," he muttered, turning back to his phone. Something in me snapped. The years of accepting that dismissal, of letting him reduce my feelings to an inconvenience, to a burden he shouldn't have to bear. All of it crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. "I found something," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Something you've been hiding." For the first time that morning, I had his full attention. His expression shifted, wariness creeping into his eyes. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the pill bottle from my pocket and set it on the table between us. The sound it made, plastic against wood, was surprisingly loud in the quiet kitchen. Robert's face went pale, then red. "Where did you get that?" "From where you hid it. Behind the coffee." I kept my voice level, though my heart was pounding. "What were you planning? Robert? Why have you been drugging me?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the refrigerator humming, the muffled sound of traffic from the street below. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "You're crazy," he said, his voice rising. "You're imagining things." "I keep those for my back pain. They're sedatives," I said quietly. "Strong ones. And I've been taking them without knowing it, haven't I? In my tea. In the milk you've been so thoughtful about bringing me." His face confirmed everything before he could formulate another lie. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of how to handle this, how to make me doubt myself again. I'd seen that look before, countless times, whenever I'd questioned something that didn't make sense, whenever I'd pushed back against his narrative of our life together. "You're being paranoid," he said, but there was something desperate in his voice now. "You're stressed. You've been tired. Maybe you should see Dr. Morrison, get your medication adjusted." "You need help," he continued, switching tactics completely now. "You're paranoid, seeing things that aren't there. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Morrison about adjusting your medications. Maybe you need to be somewhere where people can keep an eye on you, make sure you're taking care of yourself properly. And there it was. The threat beneath the concern. The suggestion that I was the one who was incompetent, who needed to be controlled and managed. The implication that if I didn't back down, if I didn't accept his explanation, he'd have me committed. Locked away somewhere where no one would believe me. How many times had he done this over the years? How many times had I let him convince me that my perceptions were wrong, that I was too emotional, too sensitive, too difficult? I thought of specific instances, sharp and clear now without the fog of self-doubt he'd cultivated so carefully. The time I'd questioned why money was missing from our joint account, and he'd accused me of being controlling, of not trusting him, until I'd apologized for even asking. The time I'd mentioned that I thought he was lying about where he'd been and he'd turned it around, made it about my insecurity, my jealousy, my inability to let him have any freedom. The countless times I'd started a sentence with "I feel," and he'd cut me off with explanations of why my feelings were wrong, misguided, based on misunderstandings. Not this time. "I know what I found," I said. "I know what you've been doing. And it ends now." He took a step toward me, and I saw something dangerous flicker across his face. Something I'd seen before, but had always talked myself out of recognizing. "Or what?" he said softly, his voice dropping to that tone that had always made my stomach clench. "You'll leave? Go where? Do what? You're 64 years old with no savings and no skills anyone wants anymore. Who's going to want you? Who's going to hire you? You'll end up in some roach-infested room somewhere, alone, and you'll realize what a mistake you made." The words were designed to hurt, to make me small and afraid again. And they did hurt. Each one landed like a physical blow, confirming every fear I'd ever had about my worth, my future, my ability to survive without him. But they also crystallized something inside me, hardened my resolve into something unbreakable. Because I realized that this cruelty, this casual destruction of another person's dignity, this was who he really was. Maybe who he'd always been. And I'd spent 37 years telling myself that I could love him enough to change it, that my patience and sacrifice and endless forgiveness would eventually transform him into the man I needed him to be. But people don't change because you love them. They change because they want to. And Robert had never wanted to be anything other than what he was. "I don't know yet," I admitted, and my honesty seemed to surprise him. "But I know I won't stay here and let you poison me. I know I won't spend whatever years I have left being treated like an obstacle or a burden. I know I'm worth more than this, even if you spent decades trying to convince me otherwise." "Where will you go?" he demanded, and now there was panic in his voice. "You have nothing. You are nothing without me." "Then I'll be nothing somewhere else," I said. And I walked past him, grabbed my purse and coat, and left the apartment. My hands were still shaking as I descended the stairs, but my steps were sure. Behind me, I could hear him calling my name, but I didn't turn back. The morning air hit my face, cold and sharp. November in New York, the temperature dropping toward winter. I had nowhere to go, no real plan, but I kept walking anyway. Down the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the bodega where we bought groceries, past the dry cleaner where I'd been taking Robert's shirts for 30 years, past the small park where I sometimes sat alone on summer evenings. Every step felt like a small rebellion. Every breath of cold air felt like freedom. I was terrified. I was alone. I had no plan and no safety net. But I was moving forward, and that was something. A woman passed me walking her dog, and she smiled at me, just a normal neighborly greeting. I smiled back, and realized my face felt strange. How long had it been since I'd smiled genuinely? How long had I been walking around with my face carefully arranged into acceptable expressions while dying inside? I ended up at a coffee shop I'd never been to before, a small place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. The warmth hit me as I entered, and I realized I was shaking. Though whether from cold or shock or relief, I couldn't tell. I ordered tea and sat by the window, watching people pass by, each absorbed in their own lives and troubles. The young barista who took my order had kind eyes. "You okay?" she asked quietly, and I must have looked as devastated as I felt. "I will be," I said, and hoped it was true. My phone rang. "Robert." I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Michael this time, probably already enlisted by his father to talk sense into his irrational mother. I turned the phone off. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I sat in silence with my own thoughts. No one demanding anything of me. No one's needs to anticipate or manage. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt like the first full breath I'd taken in years. The coffee shop hummed with quiet activity around me. A man in the corner worked on his laptop, occasionally taking sips of his coffee. Two women at another table were engaged in animated conversation, laughing occasionally. Everyone carrying on with their lives while mine had just imploded. It was surreal and somehow comforting at the same time. I watched the barista make drinks. Her movements practiced and efficient. She must have made thousands of lattes, I thought, each one the same but also unique. There was something meditative about watching her work, about the ordinary rhythm of commerce and human interaction continuing regardless of personal catastrophe. The espresso machine hissed. The milk steamed. Customers ordered and paid and left. Life went on. I thought about all the ordinary moments I'd lived through while slowly dying inside. All the breakfasts I'd made while swallowing my hurt. All the conversations I'd had while monitoring every word for potential conflict. All the nights I'd lain awake next to a man who felt like a stranger, wondering when I'd become so alone. My tea had grown cold while I'd been lost in thought. I went to the counter to order another, and the young barista looked at me with such kindness that I almost started crying again. "Rough day?" she asked gently as she prepared a fresh cup. "Rough life," I said, and then surprised myself by laughing. But maybe that's about to change. She smiled at me, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Someone who'd known her own hard things. "Good for you," she said, sliding the cup across the counter. Sometimes the only way out is through. A woman about my age sat down at the next table, and we made brief eye contact. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that asked nothing of me, and I found myself smiling back. Such a small thing, such an ordinary human interaction, but it pierced something in me that had been carefully armored for too long. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where I'd sleep that night or how I'd support myself or what the future held. But I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't go back to that apartment, to that life, to that version of myself who'd accepted crumbs and called it love. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a text message getting through before I'd powered down completely. I pulled it out, expecting another demand from Robert or guilt trip from one of the kids. Instead, it was from Clara, my neighbor from 2 floors down. We'd chatted sometimes in the laundry room, shared occasional cups of coffee, but I wouldn't have called us close friends. The message was simple. "Saw you leave upset. Are you okay? My door's open if you need anything." Such a small kindness, but it cracked something open in my chest. I realized I was crying, tears running down my face in the middle of this coffee shop, and I didn't care who saw. I wiped my eyes and typed back, "Thank you. I might take you up on that." Her response came immediately, "Please do. Nobody should face hard things alone." I sat there for a long time, watching the world continue outside the window. People rushed past with their coffee cups and shopping bags, completely unaware that my entire life had just shifted on its axis. The ordinariness of it all was somehow comforting. When I finally left the coffee shop, I walked to the public library, a place I'd loved as a younger woman, but had stopped visiting years ago because Robert always complained when I spent time reading instead of attending to household tasks. The library was warm and quiet, filled with the familiar smell of books and the soft rustling of pages turning. I got a visitor's pass and settled into a quiet corner with books on legal rights, on starting over, on women who'd reinvented themselves in their later years. Each book felt like a small act of defiance, a reclamation of the self I'd let wither. I read about women who'd left marriages at 70, at 80, who'd started businesses and traveled the world and discovered parts of themselves they'd never known existed. One book in particular caught my attention. A memoir by a woman who'd left her marriage at 65 after discovering financial infidelity. Her husband had been hiding money for years while she'd worked herself to exhaustion. The parallels to my own life were striking. But what moved me most was how she'd described the process of rebuilding. I had to learn to trust myself again, to believe that my perceptions were valid, that my needs mattered, that I deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. It was harder than leaving. But it was also the most important work I've ever done. I read until the library closed, filling my mind with possibilities I'd never let myself consider before. By the time I stepped back onto the street, evening had fallen, and I knew what my first step would be. I walked to Clara's apartment. She opened the door immediately when I knocked, as if she'd been waiting. Her small space was warm and cluttered with plants and books, the kind of comfortable chaos that spoke of a life lived for oneself rather than for others' approval. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside. Over tea at her kitchen table, I told her everything. The pills, the years of neglect, the way I'd made myself invisible in my own life. She listened without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize or explain away what I'd experienced. Clara was different from me in so many ways. She was direct where I was accommodating, certain where I was doubtful, comfortable taking up space where I'd learned to make myself small. But as I talked, I realized we shared something fundamental. We both knew what it was like to wake up one day and realize the life you're living isn't the life you agreed to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I did when my ex-husband tried to control me? I got a lawyer, got a therapist, and got out. Best decision I ever made. I was 59. Everyone said I was too old to start over. They were wrong." She told me her story then, how her marriage had slowly suffocated her until she couldn't remember who she'd been before it. How leaving had been terrifying, but also liberating. How the first year alone had been hard, but also full of small discoveries about who she actually was when she wasn't performing the role of dutiful wife. "You'll have moments where you want to go back," she said, "where the fear feels bigger than the freedom. But you have to remember that going back isn't actually safety. It's just familiar suffering. And familiar suffering is still suffering." She let me stay in her spare room that night. I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, and tried to process the enormousness of what had happened, what I'd discovered, what I was about to do. The ceiling had a crack in it shaped like a river. I traced it with my eyes in the darkness, following its meandering path from one corner to the other. In that moment, I felt simultaneously more alone than I'd ever been and more connected to myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next morning, Clara and I went to see a lawyer she recommended, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in late-life divorces. Her office was small but well-appointed, with diplomas on the wall and a bookshelf filled with legal texts. She listened to my story, took notes, and laid out my options with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. "You have more power than you think," Patricia said. "New York is an equitable distribution state. If your husband has been hiding assets, we can uncover them. If he's been trying to prove you incompetent, that's abuse, and there are protections against that. You don't have to accept what he's been doing." "But I don't have any money," I said. "How can I afford to fight him?" Patricia smiled grimly. "I work on contingency for cases like yours. We'll get you what you're owed, and I'll take my fee from that. You're not the first woman to sit in that chair with nothing but the truth and a determination to survive. And you won't be the last." She explained the process, the steps we'd need to take, the evidence we'd need to gather. She was direct and professional, but there was warmth underneath. A genuine investment in my case that felt like the first time in a long time that someone was actually on my side. Over the following days, I learned things about my own marriage that shocked me. Patricia's investigators discovered that Robert had been moving money around for years, setting up accounts I didn't know about, claiming poverty while secretly building wealth. The investments he'd always said were failures had actually been quite successful. He'd accumulated a small fortune in stocks and even some Bitcoin, all carefully hidden from me. The investigator, a woman named Donna with decades of experience uncovering hidden assets, walked me through the findings in Patricia's office. She had spreadsheets and bank statements and transaction histories that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning years. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of transfers. "Every month for the past 10 years, he's been moving money from your joint account into this private account. Small amounts, usually under 500, because he knew you wouldn't notice. But it adds up. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. There was so much money involved that part of it was even held in cryptocurrency accounts I'd never known existed. His wealth in dollars seemed endless compared to the poverty he'd always claimed we were living in. While I'd worked night shifts and denied myself basic comforts, he'd been accumulating capital and assets, building his own security while leaving me with nothing. And here," Donna continued, "these are investment accounts in his name only. Stocks, mutual funds, even some foreign holdings. We're still tracking all of it down, but conservative estimate? He's worth at least $800,000, possibly over $1 million once we find everything. The number didn't feel real. We were millionaires. All those times I'd skipped doctor's appointments because of the copays. All those times I'd bought the generic brand of everything, stretching every dollar. All those years of extra shifts and overtime and exhaustion. And he'd had money the entire time. The betrayal of it cut deeper than the drugging. He'd let me struggle, let me exhaust myself, let me believe we were barely scraping by, all while building a comfortable nest egg for himself alone. When Patricia presented these findings to Robert's lawyer, demanding full disclosure of all assets and proposing a fair division, Robert's response was immediate and vicious. He claimed I was mentally unstable, that I was making up stories, that I'd always been difficult and irrational. His lawyer sent over a counteroffer that was insulting in its stinginess, a small settlement that would have left him with over 90% of the marital assets. The letter that accompanied it was filled with veiled threats about my mental state, suggestions that if I pushed forward with my accusations, he'd have no choice but to pursue a competency hearing. Patricia read the letter, then set it down with a cold smile. "Let him try," she said. "We have evidence. He has lies. This is a scare tactic, and we're not going to be scared." But I was scared. Terrified, actually. The thought of standing in court, of having my sanity questioned, of having my entire life examined and judged by strangers, it was almost too much. Part of me wanted to take the small settlement, disappear, pretend none of this had happened. Patricia must have seen it in my face. "Look at me," she said firmly. "He's counting on you being too afraid to fight. That's how men like him win. They make you so afraid of the battle that you surrender before it even starts. But you have truth on your side, and truth is more powerful than you realize. He enlisted the children." Michael called, his voice tight with anger. "Mom, what are you doing? Dad says you've lost it, that you're making crazy accusations." I took a deep breath before responding. "Your father has been drugging me," I said quietly, forcing myself to stay calm. "He's been hiding money from me for years. I have proof. I have witnesses. I have bank statements and medical evidence. This isn't about being confused or upset. This is about protecting myself from someone who was actively trying to harm me." A long silence. Then, "That doesn't sound like Dad. Are you sure you're not confused? Maybe you should see a doctor. I mean, you're getting older, and sometimes people get paranoid. The dismissal in his voice was crushing. My own son, the boy I'd carried and birthed and raised, was suggesting I was senile. Was refusing to even consider that his father might be capable of cruelty. "Michael," I said, and my voice shook despite my efforts to keep it steady. "I found the pills. I had them tested. They match medications your father was prescribed. I have photographs. I have evidence. I'm not confused. I'm not paranoid. I'm telling you the truth, and I need you to hear me." But he didn't want to hear me. "Dad's been really worried about you," he said. "He thinks you might need professional help. Maybe being in a facility for a little while would be good. Just until you're feeling better." And there it was. Robert had already gotten to him, already planted the seeds of doubt, already positioned himself as the concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. My son was suggesting I be institutionalized rather than believing his mother. "I'm not going to any facility," I said. "I'm going to divorce your father and get what I'm legally entitled to. If you can't support that, then we don't have anything else to talk about right now. And Jennifer, even worse. I can't believe you're doing this to our family. After everything Dad's done for us, you're being selfish." "Everything Dad's done?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I paid for your college. I worked double shifts to afford your wedding. Your father contributed nothing, and apparently he had the money all along." "That can't be true," Jennifer said. But there was something uncertain in her voice now. "Dad said he borrowed money from his brother for the wedding." "He lied," I said flatly. "I paid for your wedding with money I'd saved for years. Your father spent the wedding day complaining about how expensive everything was while I smiled and pretended everything was fine. I have the canceled checks, Jennifer. I have proof of every penny I spent on both of you. And I recently found out your father had hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in accounts I didn't know about. He let me work myself into exhaustion while he hoarded money like some kind of dragon sitting on its treasure." "You're just bitter," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "You've always been bitter. You've always made yourself a martyr." The words hit like a slap. "I've been a martyr?" I asked. "Jennifer, I worked night shifts for years so you could go to private school. I missed sleep, missed meals, missed years of my life being present because I was always exhausted. And you think I was doing that to make myself a martyr? I was doing it because I loved you. Because I wanted you to have opportunities I never had." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Jennifer said, her voice smaller, "I need to think about this. I need to talk to Dad." "Talk to whoever you want," I said. "But I'm done pretending everything is fine when it's not. I'm done protecting people who won't protect me. I'm done setting myself on fire to keep other people warm." I hung up on her. It was the first time in my life I'd ended a conversation with one of my children before they were ready. It felt both terrible and strangely empowering. Clara and Patricia became my anchors through those dark weeks. Clara made sure I ate, took walks, remembered to breathe. She'd gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier, and she knew the landscape of grief and anger and confusion I was navigating. Some days I couldn't get out of bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd lost and what I was facing. Clara would sit with me on those days, not trying to fix anything, just being present. Other days I was manic with energy, cleaning her apartment obsessively or walking for miles through the city streets, trying to outpace my own thoughts. "It's not linear," Clara would say. "Healing isn't a straight line. Some days you'll feel strong. Some days you'll feel like you're back at square one. Both are okay. Both are part of the process." Patricia methodically built my case, uncovering years of financial deception and emotional manipulation. She was relentless, thorough, refusing to let Robert's lawyers intimidate her or slow her down. Every piece of evidence we gathered felt like another brick in the wall I was building between my old life and my new one. I moved through those days in a strange fog, grief and anger and relief all tangled together. I grieved the marriage I'd thought I had, even as I recognized it had never really existed. I was angry at Robert, at my children, at myself for accepting so little for so long. And underneath it all was an unexpected current of relief, a sense of something opening up that I couldn't quite name yet. One afternoon, Clara convinced me to come with her to a community art class at the local senior center. I almost refused, feeling too raw and exposed to be around other people. But something in her gentle insistence made me agree. The senior center was bright and welcoming, full of older adults engaged in various activities. It smelled like coffee and paint, and there was a low hum of conversation and laughter. It was the kind of place I'd never given myself permission to go to before, always too busy, always too needed elsewhere. Walking through those doors felt like stepping into a parallel universe, one where women my age were allowed to pursue interests and hobbies without guilt, without justification, without having to earn the right to enjoy themselves. I watched an older man working on a pottery wheel, his hands shaping clay with focused concentration. Two women practiced Tai Chi in a corner, their movements slow and deliberate. A book club was meeting in another room, their animated discussion floating out into the hallway. This is what I'd been missing, I realized. Community. Purpose beyond servitude. The simple pleasure of doing something because it brought joy rather than because someone else required it. The class was painting, something I hadn't done since high school. The instructor, a vibrant woman in her 70s named Diane, welcomed us warmly and set us up with canvases and acrylics. I noticed she moved with a slight limp, and there was a cane propped against her easel. But her eyes were bright with enthusiasm, her voice strong and certain. "Just paint what you feel," she said. "There's no wrong way to do this. No judgment, no grades, just expression. This isn't about creating something beautiful for someone else. It's about giving voice to what's inside you. Some of you might paint flowers, some might paint chaos. Both are equally valid." She paused, looking around at all of us with genuine warmth. "You know what I've learned in all my years teaching this class? The women who've been through the hardest things paint the most powerful work. Not because suffering makes you a better artist, but because you've learned that you have to express what's real instead of what's pretty. Real is always more important than pretty." I stared at the blank canvas for a long time, brush in hand, not knowing where to start. Around me, other women were already painting, their brushes moving confidently across white space, creating shapes and colors and something from nothing. Then, almost without thinking, I began. Dark colors at first, heavy strokes of gray and black and deep blue. Then gradually, almost despite myself, lighter colors crept in. Yellow, pink, a soft green. My hand moved without conscious direction, and I found myself creating layers, dark underneath and light breaking through. It wasn't representational, just color and emotion and something I couldn't articulate but desperately needed to express. By the end of the class, I'd created something that looked like a storm breaking, darkness giving way to dawn. It wasn't skilled or sophisticated, but it was mine, a visual representation of something I couldn't put into words. "Beautiful," Diane said, pausing by my easel. "That's a painting about transformation, about finding light in darkness. You've got a real eye for this." I looked at it again and realized she was right. And I realized, too, that I was changing. That the frightened woman who'd fled her apartment a few weeks ago was becoming someone else. Someone stronger and clearer and more certain of her own worth. The legal process ground on. Robert fought everything, contested every claim, tried every manipulation. He spread rumors in our neighborhood, told people I was unstable, tried to turn our mutual friends against me. Some of them believed him, but others, particularly the women who'd known us for years, seemed to look at me with new understanding, as if my awakening had triggered recognition of their own quiet sufferings. One woman from our building, someone I'd known casually for years, stopped me in the hallway one day. "I just want you to know," she said quietly. "I believe you, and I think you're brave." She glanced around as if afraid of being overheard. "My husband isn't physical, but there are other ways to be hurt. Watching you stand up for yourself, it's making me think about my own situation." We stood there in the hallway, two women in their 60s, acknowledging truths we'd both been taught to hide. "Thank you," I said, "and know that you're not alone. Whatever you're dealing with, you're not alone." One evening, I received an email from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd heard about the divorce through the family grapevine, and she wanted me to know something. Years ago, at a family reunion I hadn't attended, she'd overheard Robert talking to another relative. He'd been laughing about his plan to manage my expectations, keep me working hard while he built security for himself. He'd called me gullible, useful, a perfect little workhorse who never asks questions. The email included a voice recording she'd made at the time, thinking it was funny, but now realizing how cruel it was. I listened to it once, hearing my husband's voice casually discussing his long-term strategy to keep me in the dark, to use my work ethic and my devotion while giving nothing real in return. His voice on the recording was jovial, almost proud, as he described how easy it was to manipulate me, how I believed anything he told me. It should have destroyed me. Instead, it freed me. Any lingering doubt I'd had about whether I was overreacting, whether I was being unfair, dissolved completely. I forwarded the recording to Patricia, who added it to our evidence file. "That's evidence of fraud," Patricia said when she heard it. "He's admitting to intentional deception. This recording could be very valuable in court." That night, I slept better than I had in months. The guilt I'd been carrying, the voice that kept whispering that maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should try to work things out. It finally went quiet. I'd been given a gift, the absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing. The formal mediation session was brutal. Robert sat across from me with his lawyer, his face set in hard lines, and tried one last time to make me back down. He offered a settlement, a small amount that would have left him with the vast majority of his hidden assets. He claimed it was generous, that I should be grateful, that most women my age would jump at the chance to walk away with anything at all. His lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, laid out their position. "My client is willing to offer a settlement of $50,000 and shared custody of the marital home, requiring sale only if both parties agree. Given Mrs. Anderson's age and limited earning potential, this is a very generous offer." He smiled at me, condescending and cold. Patricia and I had prepared for this. She laid out item by item every piece of evidence we'd gathered. The hidden accounts, the cryptocurrency holdings, the stocks and bonds, the recording of him discussing his manipulation, the medical evidence of the drugs he'd been giving me, the testimony of the pharmacist who'd confirmed the prescriptions were never meant for someone with Robert's supposed back condition. Robert's face went through a spectrum of emotions: shock, anger, fear, calculation. His lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting papers around, whispering urgently in Robert's ear. "My client is prepared to be reasonable," Patricia said calmly. "We're asking for an equitable split of all marital assets, full disclosure of all holdings, and separate residences immediately. If these terms aren't acceptable, we're prepared to go to court, and I assure you, the evidence is compelling. The drugging alone could result in criminal charges. The financial fraud could result in penalties beyond just asset division." Robert tried to bluster, to threaten, to plead. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "I worked for that money. I built those accounts. She did nothing but complain and work a job any idiot could do. She doesn't deserve half of what I've earned." Patricia's smile was sharp. "Actually, in New York, we don't determine asset division based on your opinion of your spouse's worth. We base it on law, and the law says marital assets are split equitably. Your opinion of Mrs. Anderson is noted and irrelevant." I sat silently through it all, my hands folded in my lap, calm in a way I'd never been during our marriage. I'd stopped being afraid of his anger. I'd stopped caring about his approval. Let him rage. Let him threaten. It couldn't touch me anymore. I'd already lost everything that mattered in terms of our relationship. There was nothing left for him to take except money, and Patricia wasn't going to let that happen. In the end, he agreed to most of our terms. It wasn't everything I deserved, but it was enough to build a new life on. Enough to finally be secure. Enough to prove that I was worth fighting for, even if I'd had to be the one to do the fighting. As we left the mediation session, Robert tried one last manipulation. "I still love you," he said, reaching for my hand. "We can work this out. We can start over. I'll be better. I'll change. Please don't do this." I pulled my hand away. "No," I said simply. "We can't. And I don't believe you. I don't think you're capable of the kind of change that would make this relationship worth saving. More importantly, I don't want to save it anymore. I'm done." The divorce was finalized on a crisp October morning. I signed the papers in Patricia's office, and as I wrote my name for the last time as Robert's wife, I felt something shift fundamentally inside me. Not just relief, though there was plenty of that. Something deeper. A reclamation of myself. The woman I'd been before I'd learned to make herself small. The woman I could still become. With my settlement, I did something I'd never done before. I took time to think about what I actually wanted, not what someone else needed from me, not what would keep the peace or make others happy. Just what I wanted. It was harder than I'd anticipated. I'd spent so many years denying my own desires that I'd almost forgotten how to identify them. I found a small apartment in a different neighborhood, closer to the park, with big windows that let in morning light. It was the first space that was truly mine. I furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece because I loved it, rather than because it was practical or cheap. I hung my painting from the art class, The Storm Breaking into Dawn, in the living room where I could see it every day. The apartment had hardwood floors that creaked gently when I walked across them. There was a small balcony where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. The building was older, but well-maintained, full of people who smiled and said hello in the hallways. It felt like coming home in a way my old apartment never had. The first night I spent there alone, I walked from room to room, touching the walls, looking out each window, claiming the space as mine. I put my toothbrush in the bathroom without wondering if it was in someone's way. I hung towels where I wanted them. I arranged the furniture and then rearranged it the next day just because I could. Every choice, no matter how small, felt like an act of self-determination. I bought groceries for myself alone, choosing foods I actually liked rather than what Robert preferred. I discovered I hated chicken, which we'd eaten 3 times a week for decades because it was his favorite. I loved spicy food, which he'd always refused to have in the house. I enjoyed long baths with scented candles, something I'd never allowed myself because Robert complained about the smell. These small discoveries felt revolutionary. I was 64 years old and just learning what I actually liked. How many other women, I wondered, had spent decades accommodating someone else's preferences until they'd forgotten they had any of their own? I started taking more classes. Painting, yes, but also creative writing and basic web design and Italian, just because I'd always wanted to. I discovered I was good at painting, good enough that Diane encouraged me to show my work at a local gallery's community exhibition. The writing class was particularly revelatory. The instructor, a published author in her 50s, encouraged us to write our truths, no matter how uncomfortable. I started writing about my marriage, about the drugging, about the long process of waking up to my own worth. The words poured out of me, decades of suppressed emotion finding expression on the page. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Women I'd drifted away from because Robert had always made plans difficult or complained when I was gone. We met for long lunches and afternoon walks, and I remembered what it felt like to laugh freely, to talk without monitoring every word for potential conflict. to be valued and heard and appreciated for who I was rather than what I could provide. One of these friends, Susan, had been widowed a few years earlier and had channeled her grief into starting a small nonprofit helping older women transition out of difficult situations. She asked if I'd consider volunteering, maybe even sharing my story at some of their workshops. I wasn't sure at first. The wounds were still so fresh. But when I finally did speak, standing in front of a room of women who carried their own stories of survival and transformation, I found power in the telling. In watching their faces as I described the pill bottle, the hidden money, the long, slow awakening to my own worth, I saw recognition and hope, and a determination that mirrored my own. One woman, probably in her 70s, came up to me afterward with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I've been making excuses for 45 years. You just helped me see I don't have to anymore. I'm going to call a lawyer tomorrow. I'm going to start the process of getting my life back." That moment, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, felt like justice. Real justice. Not revenge or punishment, but the quiet triumph of refusing to be diminished anymore. The knowledge that my suffering, my awakening, could help someone else find their own path forward. Michael and Jennifer eventually reached out, months after the divorce was final. The conversations were awkward and painful. They wanted me to forgive their father, to understand his perspective, to make things easy for them by pretending nothing had really been that bad. I couldn't give them that. "I won't lie to protect him," I said, "or to make you comfortable. What he did was wrong. What you did, dismissing me when I told you the truth, that hurt too. But I love you, and my door is open when you're ready to really listen. When you're ready to see me as a person with valid experiences, not just as a mother who exists to make your life easier." Michael hung up. Jennifer stayed on the line a bit longer. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice small. "I should have believed you. I should have listened. I was scared, and it was easier to believe Dad than to face the truth about our family." It was a start. Maybe not enough, not yet, but a crack in the wall that had grown between us. Jennifer promised to come visit, to sit down and really talk, to hear my side without judgment or defensiveness. I told her I'd be waiting whenever she was ready. Clara and I became real friends. The kind of friendship I'd never quite had before, based on genuine affection rather than proximity or obligation. We took day trips together, exploring parts of the city we'd never visited. We had quiet evenings drinking wine and talking about books and politics and the strange, unexpected shape of our later years. One afternoon, as we walked through the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, she said, "You know what I admire about you? You could have stayed. It would have been easier, more comfortable. But you chose yourself instead. That takes a kind of courage most people never find." I thought about that. Had it been a choice, or had it been survival? Maybe both. Maybe the choice was in recognizing that survival required more than just enduring. That there's a difference between being alive and actually living. I started managing my own money for the first time in my life, learning about investments and retirement planning and how to build real financial security. It was intimidating at first, all those numbers and options and decisions. But I discovered I was good at it, careful and thoughtful, and more capable than I'd ever given myself credit for. I even put a small amount into Bitcoin, remembering with bitter irony how Robert had hidden his cryptocurrency investments from me. Mine would be different. Mine would be transparent, something I controlled and understood. A symbol of my financial independence and my willingness to learn new things, even at 64. The seasons changed. Winter came and went, my first winter in my own space, belonging only to myself. I decorated for Christmas for the first time in years, putting up a small tree and hanging lights just because they made me happy. I spent Christmas Day with Clara and some other women from the senior center. cooking together and laughing and creating new traditions that had nothing to do with obligation or expectation. That Christmas was different from any I'd known. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, no pretending everything was fine while dying inside. We cooked food we actually wanted to eat. We played music we enjoyed. We told stories and laughed until we cried. And when someone needed to cry for real, we held space for that too. One of the women, Maria, told us about leaving her husband after he'd gambled away their retirement savings. Another, Sarah, shared how she'd finally divorced her husband after years of him belittling her in front of their children. Each story was different, but the thread that connected them was the same. The moment of waking up, of realizing you deserved better, of choosing yourself even when it was terrifying. "We're the lucky ones," Clara said, raising her glass of wine. "We got out. We chose ourselves. Some women never do. We toasted to that. To choosing ourselves. To starting over. To proving that it's never too late to build a life worth living." Spring arrived with cherry blossoms in the park and a lightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. I'd made it through a year of my new life. A year of learning to be alone without being lonely. A year of discovering who I was when I wasn't performing the role of wife and mother and caretaker. I took long walks through the city, exploring neighborhoods I'd never had time to visit before. I went to museums on weekday afternoons when they were quiet. I sat in cafes with a book and no agenda. I learned that I loved art galleries and hated shopping malls, that I preferred coffee shops with personality over corporate chains, that I was perfectly content with my own company. On what would have been my 38th wedding anniversary, I threw a party. Not a celebration of the marriage, but of its ending, of my liberation. Clara and Susan and the women from the art class and the book club I'd joined came. We ate good food and drank champagne and toasted to new beginnings. One of the women asked if I was dating, if I was looking for another relationship. The question surprised me. I realized I hadn't thought about it, hadn't felt the lack of a partner. For the first time in my adult life, I was enough all by myself. Maybe someday, I said. But right now, I'm enjoying being my own person. I'm learning what I like and don't like when I'm not filtering everything through someone else's preferences. I'm discovering that I'm actually pretty good company. As my 65th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on the past year, on how completely my life had transformed. I thought about the woman I'd been, standing in that cramped kitchen in Queens, holding a pill bottle and trying to understand how her life had led to that moment. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, but I couldn't regret what it had taught me, how it had broken me open and let something stronger grow in the cracks. I painted a new piece for my birthday, a self-portrait of sorts, though abstract. Bold colors, strong lines, a figure standing alone but not lonely, grounded but reaching upward. When it was finished, I titled it Breakfast and Justice, remembering that morning when everything changed, when I chose myself over comfort, truth over convenience. The painting sold at the gallery's next exhibition. A young woman bought it, told me it reminded her of her grandmother, who'd left an abusive marriage at 70 and lived another 20 years in joyful independence. The idea that my story, my art, could mean something to someone else, could offer hope or inspiration or just recognition, moved me more than I'd expected. I used the money from the painting to book a trip to Italy, the country I'd been learning about in my language class. I'd be traveling alone, something that would have terrified the old me. This me, the one I was becoming, felt only excitement and possibility. I spent hours planning the trip, researching museums and restaurants and small towns off the tourist path. It would be my first real vacation in decades, my first trip taken purely for my own pleasure. The Italian classes had become one of my favorite parts of the week. The instructor, a passionate woman from Rome, taught us not just the language but the culture, the food, the art, the entire way of life. She spoke about Italian women with such admiration, about how they valued pleasure and beauty and connection, about how they refused to disappear as they aged. In Italy, she told us, older women are respected. They're seen as wise, as powerful, as essential to the fabric of society. They don't apologize for taking up space. They don't make themselves small to accommodate others. They live fully, right up until the end. I wanted that. I wanted to be a woman who lived fully, who refused to disappear, who took up space without apology. I was learning slowly that I could be that woman, that maybe I'd always been her, underneath all the layers of conditioning and accommodation. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about Robert, wonder if he'd changed, if he'd learned anything, if he felt remorse. Probably not. But I'd realized that didn't matter. His transformation, or lack of it, wasn't my responsibility anymore. My only job was to keep growing, keep choosing myself, keep building this new life I was claiming piece by piece. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Florida, that he was dating someone new, someone younger who didn't know his history. I felt a pang of concern for this unknown woman, hoped she'd be smarter than I was, more alert to the warning signs. But mostly I felt nothing. He was a chapter I'd closed, a lesson I'd learned the hard way, a part of my past that no longer had power over my present. I thought about my children too, hoped that someday they'd understand, that we'd find a way back to each other that was real and honest instead of performative and obligatory. But if that didn't happen, I'd survive that too. I'd learned I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resilient, more capable of building a life that mattered even without their validation or approval. Now, as I sit here sharing this story with you, I can say with absolute certainty that it's never too late. Never too late to recognize your worth. Never too late to demand better. Never too late to choose yourself. To start over. To build something new from the wreckage of what was. That morning when I found those pills, when I walked out into the uncertain day with nothing but my dignity and determination, I thought my life was ending. I didn't realize it was just beginning. I look back at photos from my old life sometimes, at the woman who smiled for the camera while dying inside. I barely recognize her. She lived in shadows, made herself small, accepted so little because she believed that's all she deserved. There's one photo in particular that I keep on my desk now. It was taken at Jennifer's wedding, the event I'd bankrupted myself to pay for. In the photo, I'm smiling broadly, my arm around my daughter, looking like the picture of maternal happiness. But when I look at that photo now, I can see the exhaustion in my eyes, the tension in my shoulders, the way I'm angling my body to take up less space in the frame. I can see a woman who's been taught to disappear even in her own daughter's wedding photos. I keep that photo not to punish myself, but to remember, to honor the woman who survived, to acknowledge how far I've come. This woman, the one I'm becoming, lives in light. She takes up space. She demands respect and walks away when she doesn't get it. She paints and learns and laughs and builds friendships based on mutual joy rather than mutual obligation. She's not perfect. She still has moments of doubt and fear. She still grieves what she thought she had, even knowing it was never real. She still hopes her children will come around, still wishes the years hadn't been wasted on someone who couldn't see her value. But she's free. Finally, gloriously, terrifyingly free. And she's learning that freedom isn't just about what you escape from. It's about what you move toward. It's about building a life that feels authentic, that honors your truth, that makes space for joy and growth and all the messy, beautiful complexity of being fully human. And that freedom, I've learned, is worth everything I had to lose to gain it. The breakfast I made that morning after my discovery was simple. Toast and tea, nothing special. But it was mine, prepared in my own time, for my own nourishment, without obligation or expectation. That small meal represented something profound, the first breakfast of my new life. And justice? That came too, not in dramatic courtroom revelations or public humiliation, but in the quiet reclamation of myself, in learning to trust my perceptions again, in building security and stability on my own terms, in becoming, finally, the person I was always meant to be before I learned to make myself smaller. So, I ask you now, have you ever lived this? Known someone who has? Have you made yourself invisible in your own life, accepted crumbs and called it love, given everything and received nothing? Maybe you're living it right now. Maybe you're the woman in the kitchen, holding a pill bottle, wondering if you have the courage to walk away. Maybe you're the woman who's been making excuses for years, telling yourself it's not that bad, that you've invested too much to leave now, that you're too old to start over. I'm here to tell you, you're not too old. It's not too late. You haven't invested so much that you can't walk away. And yes, it is that bad if it makes you feel small and invisible and less than you are. Tell me in the comments. Share your story. Because here's what I've learned. We're not alone in this. So many of us carry these quiet burdens, suffer these small deaths of the spirit, accept what we should never accept. But we don't have to. We can choose differently. We can choose ourselves. If this story resonated with you, if you see yourself or someone you love in these words, please like this video and subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Let's build a community of people who refuse to settle, who demand better, who claim their worth no matter how late in life that claiming comes. Your story doesn't end with what you've endured. It ends with what you choose to do next. And you always, always have the power to choose yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being brave enough to consider that you deserve more than what you've been accepting. Now go have breakfast, a real one that nourishes you, one that's yours and yours alone. And remember, it's never too late for justice, never too late for freedom, never too late to serve yourself first.